and economic status of the surrounding communities. So let's take a moment to look at a highlight out of that study. Here it is. This is back in 1983, and it shows 4 sites that were examined, one that straddles Mississippi and Alabama and South Carolina, and one that was in North Carolina. And what we know from this is the populations in the census areas where these sites were located were high percentages of African American populations. They were high in absolute terms and also relative to the statewide population of African Americans in each of these locations, in some cases by a factor of 2 or 3. This effort to push back on being forced to shoulder dangerous, unhealthy, and unpleasant burdens by the Black communities in the Deep South helped to foster a broader social movement that found its first large national expression in a summit convened by the United Church of Christ in 1991 in Washington, D.C. And it brought together a wide array of leaders, grassroots leaders, under the title National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit. And they spent considerable time and effort delving into the flaws and challenges and gaps in an economic system and legal system, as well as looking at dislocations in communities of color and poor communities caused by the rising trend of globalism, corporate globalism. And while all that stuff is really interesting, the important point for today's discussion is that it occurred in Washington, D.C. It was a large number of people. It generated a lot of attention. And so within 2 years, the White House under President Clinton issued Presidential Executive 12898, which directed every federal agency to make achieving environmental justice part of its mission and to identify and address disproportionately high and adverse human health or environmental effects of its programs, policies, and activities on, and remember this for the test, minority populations and low-income populations in the U.S. That's different from the traditional federal equal protection law, which usually concentrates on what are referred to as insular and discrete minorities, which American case system involves racial minorities and women, but has not historically involved low-income populations. This was a broader reach, and in the early days, the ability to enforce this idea of environmental justice and to redress environmental injustice was hampered by the fact that an executive order isn't self-executing, and so the parties, the plaintiffs, had to turn to traditional civil rights legal remedies, which largely turn on whether or not the plaintiff can prove purposeful discrimination or intentional discrimination. And for all of you who practice in the environmental realm, the idea that any one factor out of a rainbow of factors that you have to consider and balance and cross-balance against each other probably is a pretty daunting task. And in fact, it is, but not always. Let's take a listen.
Well, I was asked to a meeting, and they asked me what I thought of people that were opposing shopping center, the most prime location in our city. And I referred to obstructions as dumb bastards.
We didn't raise dumb children, and we are not dumb ourselves. And if your tongue cannot be handled any better than that, you have no place in public office.
So what occurred here is that an extraordinarily candid and odious expression of disrespect came from the mayor of the city of Gulfport then, who happened to be a chief proponent of a project that would have filled in hundreds of acres of wetlands that drained into an historically important African-American settlement known as Turkey Creek. And in the aftermath of that decision and the blowback that occurred, the proponent of the development withdrew and decided not to go forward at that time on that project as it was then constituted. And what that did was leave that creek, which was already prone to flooding because of other factors, free from worsened conditions, free from the loss of important storm protection afforded by wetlands. So most cases, though, don't involve such a frank and unvarnished and hard to refute statement by the proponent of the development. Most of them instead tend to go in the direction of, from this point forward, tended to go in the direction of proving things through patterns and through disparate, a more intensive version of the kind of analysis we saw in that GAO report. And in these two cases, in Pennsylvania and in New Jersey, the opinions detail the extent to which the parties developed a mosaic of evidence and a mosaic of decision-making factors that, taken all together, tended to rule out all of the other possibilities for why a particular community was being selected among all of the available alternatives to have to host the unhealthy, dangerous, permitted facilities. So if things had continued on this course for a period of time, environmental justice cases would have moved forward under appropriately strict conditions, but they would have been achievable. But like so many instances where there's an innovation in the law in the US, there is an undertow, a backlash. And in this case, that undertow occurred from the US Supreme Court, which issued a ruling called Sandoval, which held that no party has the authority to enforce disparate treatment regulations promulgated under the Civil Rights Act. And for non-lawyers, what that means is that only units of government have the power to bring the kind of cases that were described in the previous slide. It is not an option for private parties or private organizations themselves to act as a private attorney general to enforce these laws. So instead, what had to happen was that people had to appeal to and request investigations from the agencies responsible for that enforcement. So the problem there was that the chief agency responsible for that enforcement for the past decade had not done an especially effective job. And this was true both under the Clinton and under the Bush administrations. So it was a bipartisan shortcoming. And over the first part of the 2000s, the Inspector General for EPA found that the agency had failed to do several necessary steps to operationalize justice as a doctrine, and in 2005 even proposed to drop race as a factor for identifying disadvantaged populations, which is a really remarkable and brazen, given the origin of environmental justice in the Black Belt of the Deep South in America. But everything else, the pendulum swings one way and then it swings the other. And then under the next administration, under Barack Obama, the doctrine of environment found fresh energy and brought new resources to bear. Under his leadership, every cabinet agency was expected to address environmental justice in its regulatory making. There were middle and long-range plans put forward, including the one you see linked in this slide. There was resources made available for community capacity building and science study capacities. Those are examples of those are linked in the bottom of this slide, showing a continued racial disparity in exposures to chemicals and air pollution. And citizens were given access to the kind of tools many of you who are professionals working in this field are accustomed to. In other words, something that allows you to produce geospecific layers of information and helps you understand where are there clusters of like Superfund sites, toxic releases, water and air pollution discharges, and brownfields. And so the idea here was to empower community organizations with some level similar to that of the regulating agencies themselves. And the pendulum swings yet again. And under the current administration, the proposals quickly emerged to zero out the budgets of all environmental justice initiatives. And while that didn't take place, and there still remains an Office of Environmental Justice, and there are people out there certain things, it's dramatically diminished in staff and resources, and it's largely handled out of various regional offices. But more important, from a structural standpoint, the Trump administration just last week has released reforms to one of the most important federal environmental laws, the National Environmental Policy Act, which is what governs environmental impact statements and environmental assessments, and is one of the most probing and challenging pieces of regulatory analysis we have. And the two things that bear on environmental justice are to eliminate the analysis of indirect or cumulative impacts and consideration of whether project effects are highly controversial. These two eliminations also make the of making climate change cases more difficult. And these are just two of many more. There are several far more serious ones that I've left out for out of considerations of time. So now turning from sort of an overview of how the doctrine of environmental justice has ebbed and flowed over the past several administrations to what happens if you've got an agency decision and there is an environmental justice aspect to it, and how does that play out for a moment. The basic thing to bear in mind is a familiar aspect of American administrative law, which is that there's a strong presumption in favor of upholding agency decisions due to its technical expertise. And courts only can set agency findings aside if they are proven to be arbitrary or capricious or some other related grounds that are outlined here. And the court sits as an administrative appeal. In an administrative appeal, it does not hold a new trial, is bound by the administrative record. All of those things tend to bolster the odds that the agency's original decision is going to be upheld. So when you're looking at an environmental justice analysis in one of these settings, what do you need to pay attention to? You'll be wanting to see whether or not there are racial and poverty demographics of the affected communities. And is the community that's analyzed that way, in fact, the community that's affected? Now, that may seem self-evident, but as you'll see in a minute, that doesn't always happen. Another is community history. And because of the nature of communities of color and communities that are impoverished, there is usually less academic historical information about those than would be the case in a sort of mainstream status quo history. So you have to look for oral histories or specialty studies. You have to dig more deeply into the social sciences. You would want to see whether or not there are historic or cultural links that help to bolster the importance of the community that's under review, whether it's national or state heritage sites or historical sites tied to either the Civil War or the Civil Rights. And obviously, you would want to turn back to that map and be able to pull together any clusters of locally undesirable land uses. So those are highlights of the kinds of things you would want to see. When it comes to assessing whether the agency decision is going to stand up to judicial review, some of the questions you may want to ask are whether or not the agency failed or refused to consider a known impact, whether it made conclusory statements unsupported by the record, or did it draw a conclusion that's contradicted by all the available evidence. Those actually are pretty hard to prove, but they are not impossible. So let's move from that to a hypothetical example. And in this case, I'm going to oversimplify an actual case that I handled involving the state port at Gulfport. And in that case, the initial piece of work was to expand the footprint of the port to allow more cargo traffic to be brought in and then shipped out via rail and truck through an expressway in an adjacent neighborhood. So here is the entirety of the environmental justice analysis, and you see that it shows that the affected census tract has a low African American population and an about average economic status. So it's not low income and it's not majority African American. Well, the problem with that is that that's not where the impacts were. The impacts were not in the census tract 14. The impacts were inland further from that. So their census tract 14, the areas where the problems were, where the undesirable land uses were, all around the railroad and the connector road, were 40 to 80% African American and overwhelmingly low income. So in this instance, the analyst kind of missed the boat and left open an opportunity for a challenge. So even though that's just a threshold thing, the very first thing to look at, it's possible that the focus may be misdirected. So that's just a very simple example. As you all know, in this world, the work is much greater complexity. I thank you for the opportunity to provide you with this overview. I'm happy to take a few questions.
Okay, so Mike Shelton with Weeks Bay, do we have some questions for Reilly?
There is a statement on there from Mike Alonso. He says something about sharing a slide, share this slideshow with his department. Will it be downloadable for use by the participants?
Yes, I think there's an easy way for us to share with you a PDF that will have that information, and I'm glad to be able to do that. I think I've already shared that with the organizers.
Okay,
Great.
That's it for the existing questions.
Well, again, thanks very much. And if you need to get in touch with me, you can make contact with the organizers and I'll follow up with them. Thank you.
Thank you, Reilly. We appreciate that. Moving on, our next speaker.
Oh, wait, Margot.
Oh, right, we have a question.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
So sorry, everyone. So there's a poll open. Go ahead and fill it out. This is particularly important if you want to get CEUs. Before we move on to our next presenter, go ahead and fill out the poll. You should see it open now. We'll give it just a few more minutes. And then I noticed while that came in, a question came in for you, Reilly. They were wondering what your thoughts were on the construction of the new Formosa plant in Cancer Alley.
Well, that's an extremely compelling example of this effect that you see in Louisiana, but you also see it in the, I think, the Houston Ship Channel, and you've seen it in various other locations. And, you know, at some point, enough ought to be enough. The dilemma is that if regulators allow one or two locations like that, then the momentum becomes, it seems, inevitable to just allow an infinitely large number forward, and there's no way to draw the line. So it's a really important, challenging dilemma. I hope that they take very serious account of the fact that there's already I think a dramatic medical record that would counsel against permitting that project. But I confess I don't follow it on a day-to-day basis.
All right, it looks like all those that we're going to poll have finished. Make sure you hit submit. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. It'll give you 20 seconds to get your answers in.
Okay, thank you, Renee. And now moving on to David Perkes. While he's getting his computer all lined up, I'm going to go ahead and introduce him. So David Perkes is a licensed architect and professor for Mississippi State University. He is the founding director of the Gulf Coast Community Design Studio, which is a professional outreach program of the College of Architect, Art, and Design. The design studio was established in Biloxi, Mississippi following Hurricane Katrina and provides community engaged resilient planning, landscape, and architecture design support to many of the coastal communities and nonprofit organizations. David has a Bachelor of Science degree in Civil and Environmental Engineering from the Utah State University, a Master's of Architect from the University of Utah, a Master of Environmental Design degree from Yale School of Architecture, and was awarded the Loeb Fellowship from Harvard Graduate School of Design. Okay, David, it's all yours.
Okay, good. So you can hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you great.
Good. I always want to make sure. Well, it's so nice to be here with you all today, and it's great and always just a little bit intimidating to follow after Reilly. I have worked alongside Reilly on various community projects here on the coast, and I think you'll sort of see from the work that we're doing how we have, in some ways, very kind of similar aims. So the design studio that I've been very fortunate to lead up in Biloxi is what kind of within the kind of realm of planning and architecture would be called a public interest design practice. And in the same way that Reilly talked about public interest law, you can imagine that a public interest design practice has the same sort of aims of delivering those services, those professional services to the community that normally is left out of that process, that normally can't afford or doesn't have the voice at the table, but also, and I hope you'll see this in our work as well, also to identify systemic problems that really lead to sort of both built and environmental issues in the community that impact the community. So our work certainly does both that. And I have, first slide, just a bit of a timeline. As Margot said, we started our work right after Katrina, and we were able to quickly get a good kind of team of architects, planners, and landscape architects working in Biloxi. And without going into detail, one thing to note on this timeline is really how the work itself evolved as the kind of national conversation evolved from issues of kind of rebuilding and recovery to issues of resilience. And I actually kind of point that in time a bit. We were in the middle of a regional planning grant that was supported by HUD's Office of Sustainable Communities. And we were kind of in the middle of that. And right around that same time is when Sandy occurred up in the Northeast. And that then sort of certainly, I think, changed the conversation around risk, around coastal communities and the risks that they deal with. And so we're kind of right in the middle of that HUD-funded planning grant. The office that was administering actually changed their name from the Office of Sustainable Communities to the Office of Economic Resilience. And I sort of saw that as being a very telling and kind of strategic move at the kind of federal level to really reframe some of the conversations around resilience that in the past have been talked about under sustainability. So when we talk about resilience, and I think you all understand this, there's really two interrelated things to consider. One are the abrupt changes that come from, say, a catastrophic event such as a hurricane, here Hurricane Katrina, but also the slow changes. In this case, a very familiar image along the Gulf Coast of sea level rise and how it shows up in then sort of shoreline loss and changing in the ecology. And so I'm going to talk about the work that we've been doing in Mississippi. And I see as people were logging on that we have people from all over the US. And so I'm pleased to be able to, for some of you, talk about things that are familiar, others that might be a little bit of introduction to some of our challenges on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. So this was then the environment that we began working in right after Katrina, where in the areas impacted, nearly half the houses were destroyed, the other half were flooded. But the point that I'm going to be talking primarily about is the impact then of the expanded flood maps. And I think hopefully you'll understand and see that as we talk about sea level rise, that the leading edge, the indicator that shows up first and has a big impact in the community is how the flood maps then continue to expand and change. And so for those that are maybe not familiar with a kind of coastal community, these are communities that have been here for generations, and the flood maps then have expanded on top of them. These are not people that built in flood zones. The flood zones happened after the settlements. It's also, and this puts it within our work in terms of our role, also to help understand how these decisions being made in planning communities have a big impact on the community themselves. So on the left of your screen, this is right after Hurricane Katrina. The state organized a very kind of top-down, very highly promoted design charrette and invited teams from all over the country. And this is wording from the official document that documented that work. As you can see here, I've highlighted in red these terms that we read them now and they kind of make us cringe a bit. But at the time, this seemed very reasonable that the Gulf Coast would be referred to as a clean slate, and that the devastation would actually be seen as a fresh canvas. There on the right was one of many sort of indications that the community, this is actually from New Orleans, but it's such a striking image, that the community was very much expressing their realization that it was far from a clean slate. In fact, this is what we dealt with for years after Katrina, was far from a clean slate, actually a very messy slate of property owners that were living in travel trailers if their house was destroyed. And if their house was still standing, nearly every driveway had a travel trailer in the driveway. And so clearly far from being a clean slate, it was a very messy slate. And so our work really had to do with helping the community be part of the rebuilding process, both at the planning level and also the housing level. And I'll go quickly through this just to get a kind of context. So as Reilly was talking about some of the housing work that he was involved with policy-wise, we were involved on the sort of design end of that, where we saw all of this federal funding coming to the Gulf Coast, and we determined that we would be sure that all these households, the hundreds of households that would be going through the process of getting a replacement house, so we would be sure that they all had a part in the process. We were fortunate that we were able to get funding from the state to provide design assistance, a whole list of profit or of nonprofit partners who were getting funding to build houses. And we made it very clear from the beginning that instead of producing a few standard house plans, which would be possible, but we knew that that would not really be a long-term solution, that people would not really want to stay in that house because it wasn't necessarily the house they wanted. And so we had the sort of aim that we would say, we want houses that people will pass on to their children. And so we did around 300 replacement houses, each one then people that were getting federal assistance. And each one then the homeowner was able to sit around, you know, the table and give input in their design of their house. Obviously, as architects, you know, we knew very well that we didn't want to each time start over from scratch, but we knew what parts could be easily rearranged, and so the house then was very much a house that the owner then had a large say in. Many of the houses then dealt with the challenge of the expanded flood zone. So many of the houses then had to rethink a house that had to be elevated up, and how do you make sense of that on your property and make a house that is livable and a house that they would want to stay in. We also along the way came to understand and realize the importance of building better. And this has an important aspect, I think, of sort of the community justice component to make sure that what was getting built in ways that would then last, but also understanding how the insurance costs could then be addressed by improved construction, and we can talk more about that. But the part that I'm going to highlight and hopefully get some of your thoughts on is really this original challenge of the expanded flood zones and the impact that has on coastal communities. So we were able to get some funding a few years back to do a very kind of detailed and somewhat labor-intensive effort of going from community to community and looking closely at their flood zones, meeting with their floodplain managers and others involved with administrating the flood zone, and then to very carefully go through and add up the houses that were in the flood zone. So just to give you a sense of this, this is the 3 coastal counties of Mississippi: Hancock, Harrison, and Jackson County. And in those coastal counties, we have about 250,000 houses, so about 250,000 houses. And of those, nearly a quarter, so 23% of our houses are in a flood zone. And so this obviously has a big impact. We also then, at the same time, we're looking at what some of you may be familiar with, the Social Vulnerability Index, which came out of the University of South Carolina's Hazard and Vulnerability Research Institute, that has been sort of produced as a sort of standard of looking at what are the factors then that make a household more vulnerable to the impact, say, of flooding. And just to give you a kind of quick overview, these are some of the indicators have to do with the makeup of the household, in terms of their economic age, and other aspects that really their race and special needs that makes a big difference. So sort of going back to this map, and those that are in the group that are familiar with the Mississippi Gulf Coast will not be surprised, and those that are not will probably also not be surprised, that these darkened areas, the dark areas, are the ones with higher social vulnerability. And if you look at these darkened areas, they are also, and this is not just a coincidence, they are also in flood-prone areas, right? So these are the Back Bay areas. Those that know the Gulf Coast, the kind of Back Bay of Pass Christian, and the kind of Back Bay parts of Bay St. Louis. The community that Reilly talked about is kind of right there in the middle of the screen, the Turkey Creek North Gulfport, which is a kind of low part kind of within Gulfport, and then as we move across, then Biloxi, East Biloxi, the peninsula, the Back Bay of the peninsula of Biloxi, moving over even further to Moss Point and Pascagoula. So we see that these communities that are in flood zones are also, and not by by not surprising, they also are low income communities that are struggling with other areas as well. So the question is, what do we do then? What do we do when we have communities then that are these historic communities that then have the flood zone expanded? So you can see here, this is a map of East Biloxi, one of our historic African-American communities. And you can see that before Katrina, the flood zone was there in the kind of purple area, and it was at about 10 feet above sea level. And after Katrina, that expanded into about 16 or 17 feet above sea level. So with our relatively kind of flat topography, that includes a lot of communities then that end up being within the flood zone. So one of the things that is important in these coastal communities to recognize that the infrastructure here is very much a mix of sort of the engineering infrastructure, but also the natural infrastructure. So you can see kind of right sort of in the middle of the slide there, you can see a kind of historic kind of bayou that makes its way into the community. And this then is a place that we begin to work on with the community, some of these sort of flood challenges in a way that both improves the flood resilience, but also, and as I hope you'll see, also engages the community around being able to become much more a part of the work of resilience in the community. So this is a bayou called Bayou Auguste, and you can see the work there going on. And then this is a picture taken just, I think, last summer when I was out, showing how it naturalizes sort of back into a kind of natural waterway. So this is one of those slow change conditions of which are all over the place, and they also then often overlap with low-income African-American communities. So this little waterway, you can see in the slide, in 1958, it had adequate sort of shoreline around it, and it also had its own kind of meander, and it was for the most part above ground until it made its way back into the neighborhood. And if you then fast forward, to our time, 50 years or so, on the right there, you'll see how this waterway has been channelized, and there were only a few kind of pockets of a little bit of a natural environment around it, but for the most part, it had been channelized and then put into culverts, so that now its function of a flood mitigation landscape is significantly changed. This is sort of shows sort of our work. We were able to get a whole series of grants from different granting programs to bring in the resources into this community to essentially recreate the tidal flood zone that had been over time reduced to just a drainage ditch. So this then kind of shows, I think you can see the cross section. The lower one shows how it had been kind of channelized, retaining walls built, so that when it flooded, the water just came right out of the waterway into the community, and it also no longer functioned for its kind of tidal habitat. These waterways actually have multiple ecosystem services. They obviously are our floodway, but they also are our stormwater management, because all our stormwater has to go through these where they go out into the back bay or into the Gulf. They're also our fisheries. So those that may not know that the Gulf Coast, all of the shrimp, they spend their larval development in these brackish tidal areas. So this shows then the work as a large community project where there was a lot of community involvement. The city of Biloxi actually got involved. They then, as part of the grant, provided the earthwork, and so that was part of their participation. So you can see here, and then sort of reworking, reshaping the topography, putting down then the erosion control, and then we also put in this is called a gabion wall, as you can see here, to kind of divide between the part that was going to be left as a park, a kind of playground park, and then the part then that would naturalize. So this was shown, I think, later in the summer when we first did the work, and this now shows what it has looked like for several years now. It has grown back in. The important part, I think, of the project, though, is not just in the results, but in the process. And I think this is where we begin to engage the community around a process that not only then leads to a more resilient natural waterway, but also builds community resilience by helping to to educate and to bring attention to the importance of caring for and preserving and maintaining our waterways. So we started with school children. First off, we did a sort of campaign of them doing these kind of wonderful drawings of the animals in the bayou, and little sayings, and that we got permission from the city to go around and put on the storm drains to really get the community aware of the fact that this drainage, what people had just thought was a drainage ditch they crossed over, was actually much more a part of the local ecology. Working with high school kids, doing water quality testing throughout, and then with a lot of community involvement in the planting. So I think as I sort of wrap up what I was going to say here, I think the part that I will kind of reemphasize is that these communities that live in these flood-prone areas are communities then that have great investment in their communities, and to be able to work with them, for them to be actively working to improve the resilience of their community, to help them recognize that there are things that they can, and with the organizational and funding support that can come to them, begin to work out some of these challenges that make their community threatened. And the kind of, I think the challenges then in terms of kind of dealing with the planning challenges, there are areas that we have been working on, and hopefully we'll begin to have a little bit more work to show for it. Obviously, those are long-term challenges of helping the city begin to look at their land use patterns and looking at how do you begin to at the planning scale begin to address the issues of having so many of the residents that live in flood-prone areas. With that, I think I probably have left more than enough time for questions.
Okay, Mike, do we have some questions there?
Yes, we do. One says, Colleen says, how do you prioritize the waterways that need rehabilitation to be, whoops, it moved on me, to be more effective in stormwater management? I assume that it involves an evaluation of most flood-prone waterways and which of those are near homes or businesses, high risk in flood damage areas.
That's a so our work we have done now. Let's see, three. I guess 1, 2, 3, 4. We've done, I guess, 4 or 5 of these kind of inner city waterway projects that has to do with a shoreline, or in this case, a restoration, and it's often the case that these inner city kind of waterways are very much a part of the kind of stormwater system, and they get, so what happens with these intercity waterways is they get really degraded because of how the stormwater then obviously begins to wash silt and begins to impact them. So it's a work that I guess we have done to kind of help the cities and the communities kind of focus in, maybe not on their kind of large, sort of more natural waterways, but to pay attention to some of the waterways that in some cases have become more or less just a part of the stormwater system, and to help then the community so kind of see them that they can and should be restored back into being much more complete natural habitat. So in answer, I guess, to the question, it's more a matter of getting to know the communities and knowing where some of these impacted waterways are, and then beginning to kind of work with the community and find then the community partners to begin to address them. So it's probably not nearly so scientific, and more just based on where there's some community interest in working on some of these waterways.
Okay, and there is one additional question where it talks about question regarding green infrastructure in the floodway, but a lot of trees were removed and replaced by what appears to be turf on your slides. The question was regarding did any tree planting take place in at those sites?
Yeah, we so we were able to, as part of it, we took out a retaining wall and then sort of expanded into a whole area that had been filled in. And in that area on the uplands, we were able to plant some trees that that then began to kind of make that transition between the tidal marsh and the upland. So yes, we planted both live oak and cedar trees, which are our main kind of trees in our wet marshes.
One more actually 2 questions asked about creating engagement, creating community buy-in. So how did you go ahead and gin up the community buy-in?
So we have been working at least in the one that I showed there in East Biloxi, we've been working quite a bit with the community in general, and we became apparent. People would often say we need to do something to kind of clean up Bayou Auguste because they saw that it had been really kind of trashed. I mean, it was filled with shopping carts and bicycles and so in some ways these problems are kind of already known by the community. The community already knows where where places that need attention are, and so in some ways it's more a matter of kind of getting the helping to begin to reimagine how some of these parts in their community that they may have kind of given up on, reimagine how they can actually become a community asset. So in this case, we held a whole series of community meetings. We wanted to make sure that everyone knew what was the potential. What was it was interesting, because a lot of people are kind of nervous around the waters that we have, on the Gulf Coast because of alligators. And so when we first started meeting with the community, several meetings, people say, "So are we going to do something about the alligators?" Because what had happened, as this waterway had become kind of channelized, the people would actually see alligators would come out on the bank, and they would see them like right out in plain sight. And we told the community, said, "Well, we we can't really get rid of the alligators, but what's going to happen when we provide them with more habitat, they'll kind of stay where they belong, and you no longer see them kind of out on the bank." And the Biloxi Housing Authority, which owns a lot of the part we worked on, they used to have these signs up that said "Beware of alligators," and it just made people even more kind of nervous. Since we've done the restoration, we've had no problem with alligators. Essentially, the alligators stay put; they stay out of sight. So those are some of the just basic conversations we had, so people can reimagine how something that has been in a way they sort of gave up on, how it can become an asset. But in answer to the first question, it's not so much trying to get the community interested. The community is already interested. It's a matter of helping them realize that some of these places in their community actually have the potential to become improved.
Okay, and if there's time, there's one more question. Sources of funding for the youth-based participatory action.
I'm sorry, what was the first part of that question?
It was, what were the sources of funding with the
Sure.
youth-based participatory action?
Sure, that is in fact, there are probably people on this call that probably kind of know some of these fundings, and I should probably highlight them. So a lot of our restoration work came through the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, and they're able to then kind of on a few of them, alongside with some of the restoration funding, to get some NOAA funding from their BWET program, which we've done now, 3 or 4 of these projects where a restoration project can be coupled with environmental education. And so we've been very, I think, fortunate to be able to have some funding that allows then the stormwater funding for us to become something that we've gotten, so that we do it in such a way that it leaves with the schools then some great kind of teaching tools in their science program. And that's a whole other conversation that, it'd be better to have Kelsey Johnson, our office, who's been doing that for several years, to talk about that. But the one that I think has helped us the most has been the NOAA BWET program, which is a great program for environmental education.
Okay. Well, thank you for the questions, and thank you for sharing your knowledge with us. I think that the poll has already been established and is closed now. While Dr. Mason is getting her slides queued up, I'm going to go ahead and introduce her. So Dr. Lisa Reyes-Mason is an incoming associate professor at the University of Denver Graduate School of Social Work. For the past 7 years, however, she was on faculty at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, where she studied the intersection of extreme weather and social justice in the southeastern United States. Dr. Mason co-edited the book called People and Climate Change, Vulnerability, Adaptation, and Social Justice. She's been funded by the National Science Foundation, NOAA, and EPA, and her interdisciplinary work regularly brings social work into collaboration with climatologists, planners, and engineers. So if you're ready, Dr. Mason, it's all yours.
Great. Thank you, Margot. It's a real pleasure to be here with everybody today. Thank you for the invitation. And what I'm hoping you'll take away from my part of the talk is three main points. One, that social work and other applied social sciences are truly valuable partners in this climate resilience work together, especially when we have a focus on justice and equity. Second, that these solutions for climate resilience, importantly, are technical solutions, but also are very much social solutions as well, again, speaking to the collectivity of what we need to accomplish. And then third, that team science and collaboration to do this work, to pursue climate resilience, that team science work is harder than it sounds, but really we can all get better at it with some purpose and intent in how we go about collaborative work together. What I'd like to do first, though, is actually talk a little bit for a minute or two about social work, because with an audience such as this one, where I'm guessing probably few, if any, other social workers are on the call, I find it helpful to give a little bit of a broader view about what social work is and where I'm coming from. For a lot of people, social work might bring to mind therapy or a caseworker or somebody who works with foster kids or maybe substance use or does direct services with social welfare benefits. And all those are part of social work. Social work is actually a much broader profession as well. It's very much about social justice, about expanding economic and social and environmental rights and opportunities for people. And sometimes an analogy that we use when teaching new social workers is about the different levels of social work, so micro, meso, and macro, that I think relate to how we can also think about climate resilience and the different kinds of hazards we each work on. So you can imagine that there's a group of social workers picnicking by a river. And all of a sudden somebody sees that these babies who are swaddled up are floating down the river. Well, there's a group of social workers, the micro social workers, who jump up right away, get into that river, get the babies out, rescue them. There's another group of social workers, the meso social workers, who start to organize those micro ones, make how they're rescuing the babies more efficient, provide them with resources, things like that. And then there's a group like myself, who are the macro social workers, who do what? They get up and leave, because where do they go? They run upstream and they look at the root of the problem and say, wait a sec, what's going on here to begin with? How can we prevent this problem from even happening in the first place? And so that's how I think about my own work with climate resilience, and how I think, as you all who are in many different sectors, different kinds of organizations, might think about partnering, if you don't already, with social work or other applied social sciences. There's different kinds of interventions that you could work on together. Climate change, as those of us all know on this call, or how I think about it very much, is it's a threat multiplier. That many people's lives, the focus of this call is environmental justice. So many people's lives are already precarious. They're already dealing with financial insecurity, physical health, mental health challenges. And climate-related hazards and climate change are threat multipliers. They exacerbate these consequences for people, make some people's lives more than others even more precarious. Those images that David showed from Katrina, the immediate impact that we were looking at there was the loss of the home. So there's so much on this slide. Everything here relates to that loss of the home, the trauma of surviving Katrina, as a mental health issue, physical health that might come from being in a hazardous, a moldy, a mildewy environment, social disruption, things that, again, most of us on this call know, but the way that we need to think about these or how they're all interconnected. So another way to think about the micro, meso, macro is to think about, with building climate resilience, and how I think about it as a social worker or social justice scholar, is the importance of understanding the human consequences of whatever hazard we are each looking at, of climate change, and in particular focusing on the disparities there are so many disparities that still need to be called out and need to be brought attention to. Then we could move on to prioritization of programs and policies that can be put in place to protect minoritized or marginalized groups of people in particular. While some of us who are then on the more macro side think about, well, how do we transform us all to a more sustainable world? And where do the technical and social solutions need to come together? I mean, that's a little bit more of what I'll move into now. So as Margot mentioned, for the last several years before I moved to Denver, I was at the University of Tennessee, and I'm going to draw on the rest of the presentation on examples from my work to try to illustrate these points about collaboration and team science for resilience. So in this urban environments work that I've done for several years, I worked especially with a physical geographer, a climatologist in geography, and a water resources engineer who is a civil engineer. And we worked together on several different projects. One here that you see some pictures from is from our investigation of the urban heat island effect in Knoxville, a medium-sized city, relatively green city, but still we were looking for signatures of an urban heat island effect if they were there. And so as you can see, we had engineering students like the young woman in the middle of the screen who helped us build these sensors, kind of small weather stations that we put into neighborhoods. And one of the, speaking to engagement, the question earlier about engagement and connecting with residents, part of the work that I brought was the qualitative work, the interviews, the connecting with people on the ground. And one of our communities we worked with was a lower income public housing community in South Knoxville. And as I was interviewing this man while we were looking up at the weather station talking about it, he said, you know, nobody's ever come around and talked to us about this before. We're not just about crime and poverty and drugs. These things affect us too. And so I think that story relates very much to what partnership can bring, and engagement and taking the time to really listen to people on the ground can bring to this kind of climate resilience work. I want to pull out 4 examples of competencies for productive participation in team science. These are from a recent chapter written by Paula Nurius and Susan Kemp, a book that came out last year. I think the title of the book is Strategies for Team Science Success, if anybody wants to look for it. And Paula Nurius and Susan Kemp write about 4 different kind of buckets of competencies that are needed for good participation in team science. Values, attitudes, beliefs, habits of mind, knowledge, and interpersonal. And I've chosen 4 to focus on that I want to kind of illustrate. And again, my view is that these are sometimes easier said than done, or we might have some of these that we excel at, but others that are a little harder for us. But we can work on building these competencies in order to do this collective work together. So one that I've pulled out is having this value of having an interdisciplinary approach. I mentioned that I worked for several years with Kelsey Ellis, the physical geographer, and John Hathaway, the water resources engineer. We all met at new faculty orientation in 2013. Kelsey was telling a personal story in the lunch line that was kind of funny and entertaining. It caught my ear. We started chatting. As we sat down to lunch, we moved on from the personal to what we were both interested in. It turned out that we and another colleague, John, who we met that day, were all interested in climate resilience issues, but from very different perspectives. We started collaborating right away. And it sounds kind of like a story of chance, and there was definitely some luck involved that we happened to meet that day. But I know that part of it was more than that. It was a mindset that we each went into looking for collaboration, looking for other partners, looking for an interdisciplinary way to do this work together. So I think that's a value, a way of thinking and being and walking through the work we do that we can cultivate, looking for new partners. And sometimes I think of that too in terms of extroversion and introversion. I'm not a naturally extroverted person. And so I know, though, that if valuing interdisciplinarity and collaboration is important to me, I'm going to have to put myself out there and maybe in some uncomfortable situations that might be uncomfortable for power dynamics as well, depending on perhaps your own gender or race or class or other parts of who you are that might make collaboration networking that part of interdisciplinary work more challenging. Another of those buckets is habit of mind, cultivating a sense of non-defensiveness. And for this, I tip my hat to John and Kelsey, because the example here is how when we were doing this urban heat island work, we were identifying neighborhoods. We were new to Knoxville, and we were identifying neighborhoods for where to place these weather stations. And what you see on this map here is the 3 that are in blue, light blue, and green were the areas of town that John and Kelsey, as the hard scientists, thought made sense, for the climate data they needed. Having 3 locations was sufficient amount of data for them. As the social worker to the group, often a social worker might bring a perspective of, hold on, let's slow down, let's wait, let's find out more, let's learn more, let's ask questions, let's ask other experts, let's ask people themselves, residents themselves, what they think about what we should do. So we paused, reached out to nonprofits, community organizations, folks who work with neighborhood associations, and everybody said the same thing, which is, why are you leaving out South Knoxville? That's an obvious, you need to include a neighborhood in South Knoxville. And so I, again, kind of tip my hat to John and Kelsey for being non-defensive in this example of how to participate in team science together. Even though, again, the 3 neighborhoods were sufficient from them, they were willing to say, okay, let's wait. We don't have to rush in. Let's gather more information. And then we ended up with a better study that was more relevant to our new community because of taking the time to do that. Knowledge. So this is a third kind of bucket, other discipline accrual. So moving on from the urban heat island work, this is an example that comes from our NSF work on smart stormwater technology. So there's, as many on this call likely know, and maybe work on every day, stormwater infrastructure in our country is failing. I think it had a grade of D+ from the American Society of Civil Engineers. It's very cost prohibitive to go in and just replace stormwater infrastructure widely. Meanwhile, of course, we have changing precipitation patterns, increasing urbanization, loss of green space in urban areas, and climate change, so all a recipe for increased urban flooding. Well, technology now exists for smart stormwater, where you can install systems of sensors that monitor how water flows through the stormwater system in real time, and then install a system of valves and gates so that you can hold water in certain parts of the stormwater system, divert water to other parts, protect certain areas. But that might mean, for example, that, as you can see in this created visualization, maybe the local basketball court that's not used all the time, maybe that gets temporarily flooded as part of using a smart stormwater system. So in part, this is a technical issue, getting the technology right, but in part, it's very much a social issue, a social question. What are the social barriers, the social resistance that might occur? Is this basketball court in a wealthier part of town, in a less wealthy part of town? What are the racial demographics of who lives near this court and whose court might be flooded? So all of these are social aspects that get raised and brought to the table. But the example of it being other discipline accrual is that when I started on this project 4 or 5 years ago, for writing the grant for NSF, I knew nothing about smart stormwater. So I was learning from scratch. I was involved in the project as a social work scholar focused on the people side of issues like this, and certainly bringing an equity focus of who's left out, who's excluded, who might be sacrificed, or who's going to gain the most. But I knew nothing about smart stormwater. And so I think the first time I tried to explain what the project was about, I'm sure I used a ton of notes. And now I feel confident enough to at least give as maybe laypersons or non-technical, but informed description of what the project is about. And so that involves, from a team science perspective, a real willingness to be humble as well and ask questions and be curious. And so when we all get together, or used to get together pre-pandemic in Ann Arbor for our project meetings, we have civil engineers in the room, computer scientists, social workers, landscape architects, as well as city planners, stormwater managers. And for me, as the example here, not being afraid or embarrassed or shy to seek clarification or to be Googling on my phone, what is this term that they're talking about that I've heard 4 times and I'm still not sure what it means? So willingness to just constantly be gaining more knowledge about other disciplines. And then finally, an example from that 4th bucket of competencies, the interpersonal bucket. And this speaks a lot, I think, to the question that Ellie or Eli Polzer was raising about active engagement, is these social and relational skills. So these photos are all from our community-based rain garden project in Knoxville. So this project is again related to urban flooding. It's also related to questions of equity and justice, because rain garden programs, as many of you may know or may be involved in, are not so uncommon now in many cities. They often, though, tend to be more accessible to middle income families or wealthier families, because there's often a cost share component. A city or county might provide, say, 50% of the costs, and then the homeowner provides 50% of the cost. Well, for a lower income family, that may not be within their priority of how to spend any extra money that they might have. And so we were interested in expanding access to rain garden programs in Knoxville. And so we wrote a big grant that we didn't get, and then we wrote a medium grant that we didn't get, and then we wrote a small grant that we did get, so we could do a pilot community-based rain garden program just with 10 households in this one community. So we know that 10 rain gardens isn't going to be enough to actually, make a measurable dent in the stormwater flow in this neighborhood. But it's part of a pilot to hopefully expand into something bigger in the future. But this involves so many, just for this small 10 garden project, it exemplifies, I think, so how many different kinds of social and relational skills need to be used. And the things that come to mind most, thinking about the question earlier too, for me, with these skills, are the willingness to take time. I think you saw this in David's presentation. He didn't refer, as I recall, explicitly to how long those community meetings and relationships and things took, but I'm guessing it was over the span of a while. In my experience as a social worker, a community practitioner, these relationships aren't something that get built overnight. There might be trust issues. As an academic, there might be issues with, academics just come in and take data and never give anything back. So that's a reputation or a challenge I try to overcome as an academic, trying to partner with communities. There's working with the library in this case, where we did a demonstration garden, and first had to get the permissions, of course, from the library system, but then also really had to get the buy-in, to use that term from earlier, of the main librarian, who, as this garden was being built with permission, still had lots of questions about what's happening here. It meant showing up, getting on, asking to be on the agenda of the neighborhood association to meet with folks. It meant scheduling lots of appointments with residents and homeowners in the community, and understanding when people were no-shows, and not being surprised or disappointed or upset that maybe somebody didn't let you know their schedule had changed and life had happened and they couldn't be there when you had planned to be there. All of those we think of them sometimes as these soft skills, but they're often so much the hard part, I think, or a lot of people underestimate how much goes into building trust and cultivating these kinds of relationships in communities to do this kind of climate resilience work. So those are the 4 examples. They're really more of a teaser, to be honest, if you're interested in reading more about this and seeing what the other competencies are, because Paula and Susan write about multiple competencies under each of these categories. So that's what I have for you, and I am happy also to take any questions now, and I also have my contact information for any follow-up after the webinar. Thank you.
Great, thank you. We appreciate that. I'm going to throw it to Mike for some questions, but before I do that, I just want to remind everybody about evaluations. There should be an evaluation link in the chat box, so if you all would, please go and fill that out for us. And then also just a quick reminder about the last polling question. It's going to show in just a few minutes. And if you are here wanting to get some CEUs, some continuing education credits, you will need to fill out that poll question as well as enter your name and your affiliation in the chat box before you sign out. So with that, Mike, do we have some questions out there?
We do not have any questions, but one of the participants did say about building trust and commented on Lisa's presentation, and also said thank you with a smile emoji. So that's got to be a good thing there. Renee posted the reminder to everyone regarding the evaluation. There's a Survey Monkey link on the chat right now, so we really need for you to fill out that evaluation survey. It's very short, and it helps both of the reserves, Margot and my programs, do a better job of providing the training that you guys need. So please fill out that survey. And I think that's it from my side.
Okay, great. Dr. Mason, I will say that Mike and I have been trying to get some funding to do a similar rain garden project in a couple of cities, one in Ocean Springs and then also Alabama. So we may be ringing your chain again with some advice on some of the focus group work and surveys that we'd like to have. So hopefully we'll be able to work with you on something like that. So good information. Thank you.
That would be great.
Margot, we did have a question come in though. It says, are there specific techniques for how to practice and build skills around non-defensiveness?
I think the things that come to mind for me, and again, it's hard because I think of these as soft skills that you have to kind of be willing to reflect on, be present, be mindful in the moment as you're doing these. But for practicing non-defensiveness, the biggest one is to listen more and talk less. My daughter just got us into watching the Hamilton musical, and that's like a line in it, you know, except for it says smile more, but talk less and listen more is, I think, a big one. I think another one for practicing non-defensiveness, as simple as it sounds, but it's harder to do when you're caught up in the moment, is to just really practice that curiosity. We often miscommunicate so much with each other because of assumptions about shared language that between disciplines or sectors or professions could actually have very different meanings. Slight things in tone, in body language, that just kind of suspending, practicing that suspension of judgment, I think, is a really important skill to do. And I'll just go back to that: listen more and talk less for the non-defensiveness.
All right. So that it, Mike?
Yes, ma'am, that's it.
Okay. Well, again, I want to thank all of our speakers. It was great hearing everything that you had to pass on to us, and we can't thank you enough. If there's anyone else with any other questions or comments, then I guess we'll be wrapping it up. All right. Well, thank you again, you guys. We really appreciate it. Thank you.